Hello, fourth grade. This is the second PowerPoint for North Carolina history 1950 to 2000. So your first PowerPoint of the week was on North Carolina 1900 to 1950, and the file was too big to do 100 years again like I had previously done before. So instead we split it into two, and so this is your second half. And in this presentation, you're going to learn a lot about North Carolina and the civil rights movement and about what we're continuing to do today to help in the civil rights movement in North Carolina. Just to remind you that our focuses are all throughout the historical 4.H, which means history, the historical background of North Carolina. And what you guys learn as fourth graders are these there are more than just these different standards of learning for social studies, and so we will continue on with these focuses in mind. These are a review of the key terms from last week, or actually, yes, last week. After the Civil War, we made a lot of changes in North Carolina, and these will help go along with them. Especially in the 1950s and 60s as we continue this presentation. So it's a very big deal that you review these. Remember, to relocate is to move from one place to another. To secede is to withdraw formally from membership of a federal union, an alliance, or a political or religious organization. Remember that civil means relating to ordinary citizens and their concerns, as distinct from military or ecclesiastical matters. Civil war is the war between citizens of the same country. Slavery is when someone is legal property of another person and is forced to obey them. And discrimination is the unjust treatment of different people based on the grounds of race or age or other characteristics of human beings. There are some new key terms that you need to learn this week. They are segregate, which means to split, divide, or separate. Constitution, which is a body of fundamental principles or established precedents according to which a state or other organization is acknowledged to be governed. And an amendment is a minor change or addition to a law. When we think about moving forward in North Carolina history from 1950 on, North Carolina has a large shift and experiences many changes during the civil rights movement era. So North Carolina and the civil rights, just to kind of put a picture in your head, it was a very tough time during the Civil War for African Americans in North Carolina and for Black Americans in North Carolina. Basically, the Civil War, if you remember, was a big part of the Civil War was about abolishing slavery and freeing African Americans who were being enslaved. And those African Americans were mostly kept as slaves in the southern states like Alabama, North Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida. They were kept because they were easy workers to employ, except the only problem with employing African Americans was that they were not paying them and they were not treating them fairly, which is where we got the term slave. It's where those African American kids, males and females, women and men, were kept against their own will and forced to do labor for families for free. And so remember, the South used slaves frequently because they had tobacco and cotton fields that needed to be maintained and worked on. And so when the thought of abolishing slavery came up, they were very scared for their economic safety. And so that's why the South and the North had this big war. It was our biggest war and bloodiest war in American history on American soil. They had this war because people felt like their livelihoods were being threatened because they would no longer be able to have free labor on their land. And so after the Civil War, slavery is abolished, but it doesn't actually mean that African Americans were given equal treatment or rights as white people in America at the time. So before the Civil Rights Movement and after the Civil War, there was a period called Reconstruction, and this should be also added to your key terms. Reconstruction means to rebuild and recreate something, and North Carolina was left very broken after the Civil War. The state had to rebuild its economy. Imagine if you were a farmer and one of the battles took place on your land, you'd have to farm that land. You'd have to restructure the way you have people come to your farm and work on your farm and work on your land because you can no longer have free labor. So Reconstruction happened after the Civil War to help refocus and shift North Carolina into a better, more harmonious union and pattern. But North Carolina continued to institute policies that were still discriminatory towards African Americans. So we were still working to be better towards African Americans and their families and those who lived in North Carolina. So Reconstruction, while it did help rebuild the state, it still did not address any concerns of Black Americans in our country after the Civil War. And so in the 1950s, we have this movement called the Civil Rights Movement, and it starts all throughout the South, actually all throughout the country. The United States starts the Civil Rights Movements in the 1950s and 60s, and it was because African Americans and Black Americans did not have the same rights as white citizens in the United States. And so just some examples of how this was occurring was African American Black students could not attend the same schools as white students, and that was not okay. And imagine not being able to go to the same section of a restaurant as someone else. That was happening as well. They were also preventing African Americans from using the same water fountains as white people in America. And so there were segregation laws put into place that still kept African Americans from not having the same rights as white students and white Americans throughout the United States. So throughout this time, after the Civil War ended in 1865, I know we're rewinding a little bit, we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So I'm going back in time and talking about these amendments because they help as African Americans begin the Civil Rights Movement. So we want to address what happened in the past before the Civil Rights Movement so that we understand what was going on during the Civil Rights Movement. So after the Civil War ended in 1865, there were 3 amendments passed in the U.S. Constitution. And so when we think of the Constitution, it is a set of laws that governs the entire United States of America. So we have laws that are like a local law or a county law, then we have state laws, and then we have federal laws. And federal laws apply to the entire country no matter what state you live in. So in North Carolina, we have state law that's only in our state, and then we have federal law that's across the United States. And in the Constitution, that governs the United States. And in our Constitution, we have amendments, which are just new laws and new practices that we use to make our country better and create a more perfect union, as they would say. And so amendments are changes or additions to a law. And so to move on into these amendments, the 13th Amendment was created in 1865, so right after the Civil War ended. And so with the Civil War ending, it meant that slavery was illegal and it's abolished throughout the United States. So even though we didn't have all 50 states at the time, we still abolished slavery throughout the entire country. So the 13th Amendment was created in 1865 and it abolished slavery throughout all of the United States. Then following that, the 14th Amendment was created in 1868, and it recognized blacks and black Americans and African Americans as citizens who deserve the basic rights of all people. So when you're thinking about this, like basic rights, that we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So when you are born in America, you have the basic rights of a human being, which is you're able to pursue things that make you happy. You're able to continue your life and live your life, and you're able to be free. And the 14th Amendment recognized African Americans as citizens who are entitled to those rights. And then the 15th Amendment was created in 1870, and it gave African American men, notice I said men, the right to vote. African American women and white females in America were still not given the chance to vote. So moving into the North Carolina Civil Rights Movement, thinking back to all of those amendments, we can say that yes, those amendments made life better, but it didn't mean that it changed the way North Carolina was still treating African Americans. So throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, we were still segregating restaurants, we were still segregating schools, we were still segregating water fountains. We were still not giving African American citizens the same rights as white American citizens. And so in 1954, the Greensboro School District was the first set of schools in the states to integrate their schools. So that means white kids and black students could go to the same schools. And we started that integration in 1954 in Greensboro, and it continued throughout Charlotte and into other school districts across the state. And in Charlotte, they actually began busing students into different schools, into different districts, so that they could make a bigger effort to integrate schools with a diverse population of students. And this happened because of the Brown versus Board of Education law that was passed in Kansas, Topeka, Kansas, where they felt that it was, necessary and a right to have kids go to school with all different races and genders, etc. So it was a big deal to start integrating schools, and it's awesome that we have done that in 1954, and we have continued to practice integrating schools past that. But it started in Greensboro. The point is that we started integrating schools in 1954 in North Carolina, and we started with the Greensboro School District. And we did that because schools should not be just primarily race-based. It means that all kids deserve a public education, no matter where they live. On February 1st, 1960, the Greensboro sit-ins happened. And what happened was four African American college students at North Carolina A&T were denied lunch service at a restaurant, and it was because they weren't white. And so they said, "Excuse me, we deserve to be served just like any other customer in your restaurant." And they didn't leave the restaurant until the store closed. And then they said, "You have to get out of here." Well, the next day they showed right back up, and they sat in until they served them, which over 1,000 college students joined the civil rights movement after this first sit-in. So this sit-in was huge in the civil rights movement because it actually sparked civil rights movements and sit-ins across the country after this happened. So it was across the South, and they had supporters who would go into restaurants and sit there until they were served, because it was not fair that they wouldn't serve African American students at the first sit-in in Greensboro. As we moved on into the 1960s, we finally passed the 24th Amendment, which makes it easier for African Americans to vote. Before the 24th Amendment was passed, there were fees associated with voting that would make it harder for African Americans to vote. So the 24th Amendment to the Constitution took that off. No one has to pay a fee to vote. So more people were able to vote, including African Americans. Legal restrictions that would usually prevent African Americans from getting better jobs were removed throughout the last 40 years in North Carolina's history, and they continue to be adjusted and removed. Again, 1960 was only about 60 years ago. And so we still are making changes to our society and to our government because that's the way we were set up and designed by our founding fathers. We were given this country and we govern it to make it better for all people who live in it. So we've still been changing laws even throughout the last 40 years, and we'll still continue to change them. So civil rights and social justice issues are still relevant, and they happen today, but they just don't look the same. We don't have sit-ins anymore. African Americans have the right to go and be treated the same in a restaurant. So the sit-in is not as necessary, but there are other ways that people still continue the civil rights movement throughout North Carolina. And I have given you guys a few extra events that happened into the 2000s so that you guys can continue reading about them. And then I also, at the end of the presentation, attach some resources in case you're interested in the civil rights movement or North Carolina history. You can see that even after the civil rights movement in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, that in 1989 we had Hurricane Hugo, which even damaged as far, like very far west into the state. Even Charlotte was damaged. North Carolina, Raleigh-Durham area was named one of the best places to live in the United States. We also had a governor who had 4 terms as governor in 1996, and in 1999 we had another hurricane that slammed North Carolina, which brought lots of flooding and devastation to our eastern part of the state. And so hurricanes are a big deal in our state, and it's something that happened just in these last 2 years, and so it's part of our history, and those are some additional events that you can research if you would like. And again, here's some more resources for you about the civil rights movement and North Carolina history.